Hi, this lesson is on Interfund Advances. And in this lesson, we'll demonstrate how to record Interfund Advances. Let's first start off with the overview. And by the way, this is on page 64 of your new client handbook. So I'll give you a second to turn there. Okay, an interfund advances are temporary loans from other funds which are ultimately going to be repaid. Okay, so this is in contrast to your interfund transfers, which we went over in the last lesson, where they were not loans, but they were permanent movements of money from one fund to another. Well, an advance is different. It's a temporary, keyword, temporary loan to other funds. And they're ultimately going to be repaid, and I would add, within the same fiscal year, they're going to ultimately be repaid. Okay, advances can be made from a less restricted fund to a more restricted fund, and they are usually made from the general fund and require a resolution authorized by the governing board. Well, again, we're not the legal authorities on all the funds and the various restrictions on those funds. If you're unclear about that, you can check Ohio Revised Code. You can maybe consult with your regional audit division or local government services. But generally speaking, this by definition, advances can be made from a less restricted fund to a more restricted fund, and generally they're made from the general fund and require an authorization by your governing board. Also, there are loans from one fund to another fund that are going to be repaid. And as I mentioned, it doesn't say here, but our understanding here at UAN is that they should be paid within the current fiscal year. So even if you have a loan, let's say it's from the general fund to the road and bridge fund, and the general fund loans money from road and bridge in December of the current year, it should be repaid back from the road and bridge back to the general fund before you close out that year end, so by December 31st. And if not, then you really want, if for some reason you think, well, you can't do that, you'll want to contact your regional auditor or, again, local government services for advice on that, because, again, our understanding is that it needs to be repaid, and if there's any, I don't know of any exceptions to that, but you can check with them. Or, even better, if there's some other way to handle it besides an advance, maybe you can do an interfund transfer to permanently move that money, then consider some other way of doing it if you think it's not going to be able to be repaid within the current fiscal year, because that is the intent of an interfund advance. Well, why would you have to do an interfund advance in the first place? It's a temporary loan. Well, it has to do with cash flow reasons. If, for instance, like in the road, we'll see an example in road and bridge, you have the budget and you expect to receive revenue, enough revenue to cover your payments in that fund, but for whatever reason you do not have the cash at the time that you want to make a payment. You will have the cash. Maybe it's it's a definite that, it's a definite you will have the cash. It's part of your budget to receive the cash, but for cash flow reasons at this particular date, you're trying to make a payment and you do not have the cash balance to make that payment, then the interfund advance is one potential option where you can loan money from another fund to pay expense, or for, I assume, make most sense for paying an expense out of a fund that's short for a temporary period of time. And then later on in the same fiscal year, when you receive the money you expect in your budget for the fund that was short, then you repay back the money that you repay back the fund with that money. So again, keywords, temporary loan. If we scroll down to our highlights, we say there are only 2 software requirements for an advance. You must have an advance out appropriation account codes set up for the cash that's loaning the money for the fund that's loaning the cash. And number 2, you must have an advance in revenue code or account must exist in the fund that the cash is being advanced to or receiving the loan. Okay, and we'll get into these other points as we walk through an exercise. Good recommendation, just like with transfers, print a fund status before and after to confirm the results. Great report for that purpose. Well, here we have 2 exercises, posting an initial advance and then repaying that advance. So, whoops, wrong screen. Turn to our software. Advances. Your advanced transactions are located here under Accounting, Transactions, Interfund Advance. Click on that menu item. It opens up a separate pop-up screen, Post Interfund Advance. You have several options there. Now, before I show you that, I'm going to show you that I've done some work ahead of time. Because remember the prerequisites that you have to have an advance in and an advance out account code set up. So under Accounting Maintenance, I've already activated or added an appropriation account. Sort by name here. You can see advances out for the general fund. And that's all I need for the initial advance. But it makes sense that since I know we're paying back this advance from the road and bridge, the general, I also set up a road and bridge advances out so that at a future date I don't have to do that work then. I can just I took care of it right away. So that I added that using the add button. And then also under maintenance revenue accounts, I also added, sort by name again, advances in for the general for the road and bridge, which is all I need at this point for the initial advance. And when I do the repayment advance, I'll need the advances in for the account code, revenue account code for the road, not road and bridge, for general fund. All right, so that brings us back to accounting transactions. We've got our prerequisites 1 and 2 from the book in place, and now we'll go back to Interfund Advance. And we can see the different types here. In advanced types, we have to select one. Well, for the initial advance, you need to select initial advance. And then we'll get to the payment options in a moment. You put in your amount, the date that you want, the post date. Optionally, you can put in the board approval date and the approval date and number. Good idea to do that. And then a reason for the advance. Well, let's see, our reason is loan to road and bridge. And I'm going to make this $50,000 instead of $50, which was in our example. A little bit more realistic. And we'll just put in our post date and today's date. And then you can see here under From, you select because I set up the account codes, it shows me each fund that I have a advance out account code set up for. And it gives me a preview of the pooled cash balance. Well, I'm trying to advance $50,000 from the general fund, so I've got to have at least $50,000 in my pooled cash balance. And I do have more than enough there in the general fund. So I'll select that, and that allows me to select the appropriation account code, the advances out account code that I have active in my chart of accounts. And then I want to increase the balance in the road and bridge by $50,000, so I'll select that fund. And then the revenue account code advances in. So I guess there's really three prerequisites. One, you have to have the two account codes active, the appropriation account and the revenue account in the receiving fund. And then you have to have enough of a cash balance in the fund that's sending the money, the from fund, in order to, and at least the amount of the advance in your pooled cash balance. So another good reason to print your fund status, because that'll show your pooled cash balance in that fund. All right, so once you've got everything in place, you simply click on the Post button, and it gives me a little confirmation message. If all goes well, posted advance of $50,000 from Fund 1000 to 2031. All right, so now let's pretend some. Now, of course, at this point, you close the form. It'll prompt you to print a report, and I want to go ahead and do that. It says, you want to print a report? Normally I would. I'd say no for our class. And then we'll pretend some time has advanced. So it let us, got some more money in the Road and Bridge Fund. We made a big payment, and thanks to that advance. We had enough money, cash balance in that fund, so we made a big payment out of the Road and Bridge. And now some time's passed, and we got some receipts in Road and Bridge, and we want to be able to pay back the general fund. So we go to Accounting Transactions, Interfund Advance, and this time our advance type will be Repayment Advance. We'll get to this third option in a moment, but so we select Repayment Advance, and the nice thing about it is it remembers our initial advance and the amount and everything, so forth. So here we can say that our remaining balance, the amount of the initial advance was $50,000, the remaining balance is $50,000, the account codes and so forth, the post date. And it fills in part of the screen for us. So I'll fill in the date. Once again, we'll pretend it's in the future, and we'll just say, now I'm going to say this is actually a partial repayment. Let's say I can only repay $20,000, but I want to kind of get that in there now that I got a little bit more money in the Road and Bridge. So I'll say partial repayment of loan. So I'm changing our exercise in the book a little bit. So we got Road and Bridge, so we're paying, and I've got that account code active, so it's there for Road and Bridge. I did that ahead of time. And then the general fund, I've got my advances in revenue account. Again, no budgets for this at all. And so I can post a partial repayment, $20,000. Get a little confirmation. But let's say, okay, some time passes. Now again, print fund status before and after. Some time passes, and now I can repay back even more of that. So I'll select Repayment Advance, and we can see from this drop-down menu that my initial advance was $50,000. The remaining balance to pay back from the Road and Bridge to the general fund is $30,000. That's what I owe to the general fund still. Well, let's say I still don't have enough money, but I've got a little bit more, so I'm going to pay back $15,000. Now, if you get all the money, $50,000 all at once, and you want to pay it back or you want to wait, you can do that, but I'm just kind of showing this for the purpose of demonstration. Another partial payment. So now we can see just owe $15,000 back. Once I get some more revenue, I can pay the rest of that balance off. All right, so that's for 99% of you. Those are the only two options you'll ever need to use: the initial advance and the repayment advance. For those of you who are converting to UAN this year or have gone through a conversion in the current year, then you may or may not have to use this option, repayment advance not posted in the system. Well, as you'll see at the end of the end of the accounting lessons, there's a conversion lesson, a couple of them. And depending on the conversion type, you may or may not need to use this. Some conversion types, if you had an advance earlier in the year, you'll record it, and then you'll record it just like this. Other conversion types, you may not record the initial advance in the current year. You may not have recorded in the UAN system, I mean. So if that's the case, well, you still have an option to repayment. And you can see this question mark. It kind of explains that. Use this option when posting a repayment advance for an initial advance that is not listed in the drop-down menu of the repayment advance. So if you never recorded an initial advance in the UAN system, but you did it in some other system, such as manual books or another accounting software that you had before UAN, then you may, depending on your conversion type, you may use this option. The other one is if a previous version of UAN. That's probably no one listening to this recording falls in that category. We're not talking about different versions of this software, but a completely different type of UAN software. So we'll just say, for those of you converting, you have this option, and here you just plug in all the information. So there's really not much difference between these two. This just does some of the work for you and is a little bit cleaner. So I'll go ahead and close that. You can print a advance report. Normally you would want to do that. But I'm going to show you a couple other reports that are useful. So if you go to Accounting, Reports and Statements, well, you can see the Interfund Advance report. And there's a number of options there. And that's great for maybe to file with your audit. You can see I actually avoided a few advances here. You can see those. And you can also see my examples right here. So I still owe $15,000. Haven't repaid the full amount yet. Another good report, I already mentioned the fund status under fund reports, but if you look under fund reports, there's also another Big Six report. I don't know if we've discussed yet, so we'll take a look at that. The cash summary by fund report is excellent for this reason. I'll select year to date so we get everything on it. And select all. So one-page report, and so I'm going to select all my funds and display it. It's one of those 8.5 by 14s. We'll zoom in. And we can see all of our funds. It'll show us the January 1st fund cash balance, any fund balance adjustments that you've done throughout the year. I will get to those in utilities. Revenue, excluding transfers and advances. So it shows you your revenue received in each fund. Remember, this is all by fund. If we look, scroll over here. And then our transfers in and transfers out. So remember the cash transfers we did in the last lesson? Well, there's the out from the general fund and into the road and bridge. That was permanent, so there's no change there. And so far, year to date, I've recorded 35,000 advances in, and or actually 50,000 advances out of general fund, and I've only repaid back 35,000, so we can see that clearly here. And my initial advance to road and bridge was 50,000, so we still owe 15,000 back to the general fund. We can see from this report. It also shows your expenditures, and because this is year to date, it's going to show me the end of year fund balance. If I selected month to date, it would show me as of the end of this month. Also shows you like your I think in fund status, your pooled cash balance and your non-pooled cash balance. So it's a really nice report to see your cash at a glance, real simplified, summarized. A lot of fiscal officers like this. I'd like to give this to their board or council for something easy for them to see where you stand with your cash. All right, that's it for advances, interfund advances, and I believe the next section is checking transfers.